In this video, I'm going to demonstrate the working properties of 3 unusual nibs created for calligraphy. While not designed for drawing, with practice they can yield very interesting results for the artist, which is why I felt it worthwhile to show them to you today. Here they are. The first one is called a Concord Nib, which is a standard steel No. 6 nib made by Yovo with a modification done by the Toronto Pen Company. The second one is a very wide No. 6 3-tined steel music nib from Franklin Christoph. And the third is a nib from a Pilot parallel pen, which was custom ground by the Toronto Pen Company into what they call a ruling pen modification. Let's take a look at the first one, the Concord Nib. This is similar in concept to a fude nib, the difference being that here the nib is bent forward as opposed to the fude where the nib is bent backward. I really like drawing with fude nibs because of their tremendous versatility and was curious to know what the differences might be, so I decided to buy the Concord Nib. Since this nib is housed in a standard No. 6 Yovo housing unit, I decided to put it into an Opus 88 Jazz demonstrator pen. It turned out that this pen is a very good choice for this nib, since it has an enormous ink capacity because it's an eye drop filler. Okay, let's give this nib a try. The properties here are very similar to a fude, in that line variation is achieved through changes in angle. If I hold the pen at a more vertical angle, like so, it'll write with an extra fine or a fine line. And then as I hold the pen at a flatter angle, the line will widen. A little wider still, also like the fude nib, it'll put down a very, very thin, extra fine line if you hold it, in this case, right side up as opposed to upside down in a fude. So just to show you a comparison between the Concord nib and the fude nib, here's a fude. Let's change the angle a little bit. Quite similar. And then upside down. Now, there are slight differences, however, and I think they're pretty interesting. If you look at the profile of the Concord nib, you'll see that the curve is a little bit more gradual, as opposed to in the fude where there is a distinct bend in the nib right here. This more gradual curvature allows this nib to create a rougher edged broken line, even on relatively smooth drawing paper such as this. Besides the rougher line, the Concord also has one distinct advantage over the fude. With many fudes, if you hold the nib flatter than 45 degrees, the feed will make contact with the paper. So if I hold it past 45, it no longer draws, and you can actually see the feed scraping against the paper here. With the Concord, you can hold the nib very, very flat against the paper without any problems. So I can go from 45 degrees to 30 degrees to, I don't know, this is maybe about 10 degrees, right, without any issues. Because I can hold this pen really flat like this, it allows me to change my grip from my standard writer's grip to my thumb and forefinger grip, which is often preferred by many artists, particularly when you're drawing the figure, because it gives you a little bit more control over larger movements. It engages the entire shoulder. This grip is also much better for larger drawings. Now, I don't want to give the impression that this nib can only produce rough lines, because it's also, like the fude, capable of producing smooth lines as well. It's really all about the pressure and the speed at which you work. If you want the line to be rougher, you can work a little bit lighter, a little bit faster, and if you want the line to be a little bit smoother, work a little more methodically, be a little more consistent with the pressure, and it'll put down a stroke that doesn't look like it was made with a Concord nib at all. Here are some drawing samples done with a Concord nib, and while I draw, I'll talk about if this nib is worth getting. I personally find the differences in working properties between the Concord and the Fude nibs interesting, and really like the broken line effect that the Concord nib produces. Because of my academic training, I find it difficult to be really expressive and bold in my drawings, but I find that using this nib gives me permission to work looser and create drawings that are bolder and more expressive. I also like that this pen allows me to work using the thumb and forefinger grip and hold it really flat against the paper, because I think that's a really rare quality in a pen. I would say, if you're not interested in that rougher, more expressive line and super thick stroke, then I would stick to your Fude pen. This Concord nib modification is not cheap, running about $66 US, not including shipping. Considering that you can easily get a well-functioning Fude pen for under $20 and a Fude nib you can put in other pens for under $5, it's up to you to decide if the cost-to-benefit ratio is right for you. Okay, on to the next nib. This again is a 3-tined music nib which I purchased from Franklin Christoph. This is an American company that makes very well-designed pens using all kinds of unique, pretty materials, and also offer nibs with a large variety of specialty grinds. I initially did not get this nib to draw with, but because I thought having a pen with a very thick line would be useful during demonstrations. I ended up not using it for that purpose, not even once, but to my surprise, this nib, once again with a little bit of practice, turned out to be really fun to draw with. The main issue with italic or stub nibs is that they make thick lines on the vertical stroke and thin lines on the horizontal stroke. Here's a vertical stroke, here is a horizontal stroke. But in drawing, we need to be able to control line width in every direction. The problem isn't all insurmountable, however, if you consider that a similar limitation exists with flex pens. So with the flex pen, the tines can only bend on the downstroke, on the vertical stroke, and then on the horizontal stroke, you really shouldn't put any pressure down at all. With flex, that limitation is easily overcome by simply rotating the pen so that the tines are aligned with the direction of the stroke. So if I want to make a diagonal stroke, I'll simply rotate my arm, or I can rotate the paper, right? So a similar degree of control can be attained with this nib by simply rotating the pen to achieve the desired thickness. So I can go on the downstroke, and then if I rotate the pen, I can thin out the line, rotate the pen, thin out the line even more. So to get a very thin line, you hold the pen so that the flat edge is parallel to the direction of the stroke, like so. And then to thicken, you simply rotate it a little bit, and it'll go thicker, 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 until it gets very thick. This might feel a little bit awkward at first, but really, considering that you can also rotate the paper, this becomes second nature quickly. As with any drawing instrument, you want to get to the point that you're no longer conscious of it, and that it simply becomes an extension of your hand doing exactly what you want it to do. Now, I'm probably not quite there yet with this pen, but every time I draw with it, it gets a little bit easier, so I think that if I dedicate enough time to it, it'll produce some very interesting dividends. Okay, now I'm going to do a short demo of this pen's working properties. One thing that surprised me about this nib is that it also responded well to pressure. I think, and this is just my opinion, that because the tip of the nib is slightly curved, when using light pressure, only 2 of the tines make contact with the paper, producing a light stroke. This allows me to sketch in my drawing before committing to thicker lines, something I always appreciate in a nib. A similar property exists in the only other pen I have with a music nib, the Noodler's triple tail. The geometry of the triple tail nib is very different, however, being rounded rather than flat, so perhaps different forces are at work here. Again, rotating the pen to control the width of stroke takes getting used to, but if you think about it, this kind of manipulation is not that uncommon. In painting, for example, one often does the same when working with flat brushes. As with the Concord nib, I find myself really enjoying the variety of mark making here. It produces a really lovely range of strokes, both rough, expressive, or smoother and more elegant. The kind of marks produced by this pen remind me of the bamboo reed pens that were used by Van Gogh in his drawings. It creates a large variety of interesting marks and textures, and is just really fun to use. And here's the last one I'd like to show you. This is originally a 2.4mm italic nib from a pilot parallel that was ground down into a curve by the Toronto Pen Company into what they call a ruling pen modification. While this mod might be new to artists, it's actually quite well known among calligraphers that specialize in Arabic script. I was very impressed by the writing samples done with this pen that were featured on the Toronto Pen Company website, and though I'm not a calligrapher, I thought that the variety of lines produced by this nib were very interesting, and I decided to give it a try. The other thing that very much appealed to me is that this nib easily pulls out of a pile of parallel and by some miraculous turn of events slides perfectly into any one of the Opus 88 demonstrators that use number 6 Yovo nibs. The conversion is actually very simple. There are plenty of tutorials on YouTube, but you just pop it out of the pile of parallel, and then you can take the nib and slide it directly into the Opus 88 demonstrator. There is a little rubber O-ring that you have to preserve, so I recommend watching the tutorial on it before you do the conversion. Now, of all 3 nibs, this one probably took the most getting used to, but also the one that produces the largest variety of lines. It's definitely scratchier than the other 2 nibs because it's not tipped, but really nothing out of the ordinary, and for those used to using tip pens that use nibs without tipping, nothing particularly scratchy. Similar to the Fude nib and the Concord, the line is controlled with angle. So if I hold the pen vertical, I can produce a very thin, extra fine line. And then as I lower the angle, the line will thicken, 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 thicken. And just like the Fude and the Concord, if you rotate it upside down, it'll produce a very, very, very thin line like so. Now, in this case though, you can also control the line width with rotation and not just shifts and angle, the same way line width is controlled with the music nib. So by keeping the nib parallel to the stroke, like this, I can create a very thin line, and then if I rotate it, it'll go thicker, thicker, until the nib is parallel to the stroke and it creates a thick line like so. So in effect, this nib is a combination of the Concord and the music nib, in that I can change line width in 2 different ways. Again, with shifts in angle, and also shifts in rotation. That's pretty interesting, I think, and makes quite a versatile drawing tool. Now again, for some this might take a little bit of practice before it becomes comfortable, but I think my training as a painter makes this almost second nature. After all, paintbrushes come in all different shapes and sizes, so they can be square, they can be rounded, they can have flat ferrules, round ferrules, they can be long, short, so on and so forth. And I think because of that, painters are used to holding their tools with different grips and different angles, so for me anyway, this really isn't all that foreign. Okay, here's a short drawing demo using this pen, and while I'll draw, I'll make some concluding remarks. So, to conclude, all 3 quote-unquote weird nibs are really interesting fun options for sketching that create all kinds of funky and expressive lines. Of all 3, however, I think that the parallel pen modification is the most interesting, because it can be used in so many different ways. It's also pretty neat that you can use this nib in an Opus 88 demonstrator, because that's a very nice pen with an enormous ink capacity. Furthermore, since pilot parallels are fairly inexpensive, I'm curious to try doing this modification for myself using a rotary tool and some sandpaper. There are several YouTube tutorials out there on how to do it, and I just ordered a few pilot parallels of different sizes. If any of those experiments produce results worth sharing, I'll feature them in a future video. Perhaps I'm a restless spirit, but I really love experimenting with new pens, new inks, papers, and new approaches to drawing in general. Not to get overly philosophical here, but I strongly believe that there should be 2 parts to one's artistic journey. Part of one's practice is to carefully choose materials and methods that best serve the kind of work you want to create, and through long practice, perfect the use of those materials and methods. But it's also very important to evolve and to seek out potentially better ways of doing things, so a large part of your practice should be dedicated to experimenting with new ways of working. I like trying materials that take me out of my comfort zone and force me to work in different ways. Sometimes those experiments are simply fun dead ends, but you never know. It could just be that that experimental tinkering you did with a new material or technique will turn into something more significant and even completely transform the way you make your art. Thanks for watching this video, and of course, as always, if you have any questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll be more than happy to respond.